Trevor McCrisken joins me now, expert in US politics and international studies. There's a lot of finger pointing, isn't there, this morning, Trevor, at Joe Biden and his decision to pull out?
Yes, there is. And it obviously wasn't a decision that was first taken by Joe Biden. This was based on an agreement that the Trump administration drew up with the Taliban last year to withdraw US troops this year. And Biden went through with that. He delayed the withdrawal slightly, but still said that all US troops must be out by the 20th anniversary of September 11th, 2001, the terrorist attacks, which sort of started the intervention in the first place. That was the justification for the United States invading Afghanistan almost 20 years ago. But of course, over that 20-year period, the initial objective of trying to prevent Afghanistan being a place where terrorists were being trained and then traveling to the rest of the world and carrying out terrorist attacks, that objective may have worked reasonably well, but what didn't work properly was trying to bring peace and stability to Afghanistan. And as your report there has suggested, much quicker, I think, than most American officials expected. The existing structures that they put in place, the governing structures that they put in place over the years, have just fallen apart in the last few days as the US troops withdraw and the Taliban have advanced. And so, lots of finger pointing for certain against the Biden administration. Was this the right thing to do? But there was a lot of interest in the US in finally ending the war in Afghanistan, what they called the forever war. Started it some 20 years ago because of the terrorist attacks against the United States. That imperative not as strong anymore, and a lot of people in America thinking that this was the right time to finally get American troops out, bring the troops home, and not have them in harm's way anymore. But of course, the consequences in Afghanistan itself now we're seeing are really quite dire.
I mean, this can't have come as a surprise, can it, to America that this has happened, the collapse of Kabul so quickly?
I think the rapidity of it is probably a surprise. There's a lot of comparisons being made with the Vietnam War, the end of the Vietnam War, where the United States withdrew its troops, and then the North Vietnamese finally took over South Vietnam and Saigon fell. That took 2 years, however. It was a so-called decent interval between the time that the US troops withdrew and Saigon fell. This has obviously happened while the US is still withdrawing. I mean, they haven't got all of their officials and troops out of Afghanistan yet, but nonetheless, the Taliban immediately have acted on the ground and have very rapidly taken over. The Afghan forces that have been trained up by the Americans have been given all sorts of equipment and money to sort of defend the country against the Taliban advances, have just given way and allowed the Taliban to take over. So I think that the quickness with which this has happened has surprised the Americans. They obviously didn't have the sort of full intelligence of what was going to happen. But in a lot of ways, it feels like it was kind of inevitable that the Taliban would take over again at some point. But I think it's just how quickly it's happened that is a big surprise. And that may end up having really quite negative impacts on Biden's popularity in the US, to see how quickly Afghanistan, the sort of rule that the Americans put in place there with their allies in Britain and elsewhere, has just crumbled as they've pulled away.
And lots of conversation this morning too about the way this news has been received by countries like Russia, Iran and China. Presumably America will be keeping an eye on those diplomatic relations too.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose whenever the United States has its objectives defeated in some way or another, those other countries that are its rivals internationally will look to take advantage of that. And certainly those are important regional players. They may have influence going forwards in the region now that is stronger than perhaps they might have had otherwise. And it's those larger calculations of the power relations between the big states, which is very often at the forefront front of why the United States or indeed other countries decide to intervene in a particular place or indeed withdraw from a particular place. And so again, what happens in those relations, I think, will have a big impact on the way in which this is interpreted going forwards, and the kind of impacts that it has on US foreign policy more broadly. How far do you think allies will be able to rely on the United States going forward if you have the US on your side and they intervene to try to help you? Are they going to have the staying power? Are they ultimately going to leave you, and then you have to deal with the circumstances on your own? And perhaps, as we're seeing in Afghanistan, that can't be done as effectively without that American support. So there are lots and lots of big questions that I think we can't answer immediately now because we don't quite know how these things are going to play out. But it's going to be very consequential, I think, this American withdrawal, and the as you say, the quickness with which the kind of structures that the US has put in place there have just fallen apart, and they've not had the outcome that they were hoping for at all in Afghanistan. We're going back, it looks like, to the sort of rule that we had 20 years ago that was very brutal and very much against the interests of the US and its allies. We could well see that being imposed very quickly again in Afghanistan now.
Trevor, thank you very much indeed. Trevor McCrisken, expert in US politics and international studies.